Picture this. The streets of Rome in the year 67 AD are alive with the buzz of merchants and gossip. The air smells of fresh bread from street vendors and smoke from sacrificial altars. In the Forum, where senators debate and statues of long-dead heroes stand in marble silence, the emperor himself makes an appearance. Nero, draped in royal purple, strides confidently through the crowd. At his side walks a figure so radiant that every head turns draped in silks, adorned with jewels, moving with the poise of an empress. The onlookers whisper in hushed tones. They know the terrifying truth. That glittering wife of Nero was once a boy named Sporus. What you are witnessing is not merely a scandal, nor even an example of imperial decadence. It is something far darker, one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical domination in recorded history. This is not a love story. It is a story of power, of grief twisted into obsession, of human identity stripped away until nothing remained but a reflection of one man's madness. And yet within this story, there is also survival, cunning, and finally, a defiance that history could not erase. Think about it. 2,000 years ago, in the beating heart of the Roman Empire, the most powerful man in the world forced the people of his empire to accept an illusion. Nero demanded not only obedience in law and tribute, but obedience in thought itself. He took a boy, reshaped him into the image of a woman he had killed with his own hands, and paraded him as an empress before the eyes of millions. And no one dared speak the truth aloud. Sporus. His name may not be etched in monuments or celebrated in epics, but his story is unforgettable. Once you've heard it, you cannot look away. But before we meet Sporus, we must turn our gaze to the man who orchestrated this tragedy, Nero, a name that has echoed through the centuries, shrouded in infamy synonymous with excess, cruelty, and fire. Yet Nero was not born a monster. In fact, when he first ascended the throne as a boy of 16, many Romans believed a golden age had dawned. He was charming, generous, and at least in those early years beloved by the people. So how did a hopeful young ruler become a man who blurred the line between reality and delusion, love and possession, life and death? What broke inside him that he would one day demand an entire empire to applaud as he wedded a ghost brought back in another's flesh? The answer lies in a story of passion and loss, a story of a woman whose beauty captivated an emperor and whose death shattered his sanity. And in the shadow of her absence, a boy named Sporus was drawn into a nightmare that would end only with his death. Nero Claudius Caesar was never meant to be the shining star of Rome, yet fate and political maneuvering placed the imperial diadem upon his head at only 16. Imagine the city then, the marble temples gleaming in the sun, the aqueducts carrying water across miles of countryside, and a restless population of nearly 1 million souls. When Nero was proclaimed emperor in 54 AD, Rome was an empire of 60 million people, its power stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the windswept hills of Britannia. At first, the young ruler seemed like a gift from the gods. Ancient historians, even the ones who despised him later, admit that his early reign inspired hope. Taxes were reduced, the grain supply was stabilized, and he funded public entertainment that allowed even the poorest Romans to enjoy spectacles once reserved for the elite. Nero, unlike his predecessors, presented himself as a man of the people. He mingled with the crowds at the Circus Maximus. He sang. He performed on stage, scandalous behavior for an emperor, but intoxicating for those who felt Rome's rulers had grown too distant. For a while, it worked. Citizens praised him, poets compared him to Apollo, and some even dared to hope that his reign marked the beginning of a new golden age. He was young, handsome, and, perhaps most importantly, unburdened by the bloody reputation of his predecessors. But absolute power does not simply elevate, it isolates. The Emperor of Rome sat on a throne both magnificent and suffocating. Every word he spoke could change the lives of millions, and yet he could trust no one. Friends were opportunists, advisors were flatterers, and even family members schemed behind his back. From the very beginning, Nero was surrounded by those who whispered what he wanted to hear, never what he needed to know. This isolation bred paranoia. He learned to suspect betrayal everywhere, because betrayal was, in truth, everywhere. Rome's history was full of emperors who fell not to foreign armies, but to their own guards, their own senate, even their own wives and sons. Perhaps it was inevitable that Nero would become a man constantly watching shadows, convinced that every ally might turn assassin. And yet, paranoia alone does not explain his descent. Something deeper simmered within him, a restless hunger to be more than just a ruler. Nero saw himself as an artist, a poet, a divine figure touched by the gods of creativity. The Senate might have preferred a cautious statesman, but Nero longed to be adored as a performer, worshipped as a visionary. His reign became a stage, his empire an audience, his life a performance from which there was no intermission. Still, in those early years, his youthful charm shielded him from the consequences of this self-indulgence. Romans forgave his eccentricities because he gave them bread and games, music and color, relief from the burdens of daily survival. They laughed when he played the lyre, applauded when he sang, and reassured themselves that eccentricity in a boy emperor was harmless, even endearing. But the weight of absolute power is a slow poison. Over the years, Nero's need for admiration turned into a need for control. He began to confuse applause with love, obedience with loyalty. He demanded not just compliance, but adoration. Anyone who failed to supply it became dangerous. And in the middle of this fragile balance between hope and fear, between art and empire, Nero met the woman who would change everything, Poppaea Sabina. She was beautiful, ambitious, and dangerously captivating. She saw not only the emperor, but the boy behind the crown. And for Nero, that was enough to ignite an obsession so fierce it would consume them both. The golden boy of Rome was about to transform, and his descent into madness would begin not with politics or war, but with passion disguised as love. When Poppaea Sabina first appeared in Nero's life, she was already a figure of fascination in Rome. She came from an aristocratic family, refined and wealthy, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that made heads turn long before anyone noticed her beauty. Ancient writers describe her as luminous, with skin like ivory, hair glinting with gold, and eyes that seemed to command rather than plead. But more than her beauty, it was her intelligence and ambition that made her dangerous. At the time, Nero was married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. Octavia was a tragic figure, dutiful, quiet, and politically convenient, but by all accounts unloved. She embodied Roman virtue, obedience, modesty, restraint. But to Nero, she was a shadow, a wife chosen for him, not by him. Poppaea, on the other hand, was the opposite of everything Octavia represented. Where Octavia was subdued, Poppaea was dazzling. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea seemed to shine brighter the more eyes were upon her. She was vivacious, quick-witted, and unafraid to dominate conversation, even in the presence of powerful men. For a young emperor who longed for admiration and feared being forgotten, Poppaea was intoxicating. Their affair began as scandal, little different from the countless intrigues whispered through the marble halls of the Palatine. Rome was no stranger to emperors taking lovers. Gossip about palace affairs was as common as debates over gladiator matches. But what set this apart was Nero's reaction. He didn't just fall for Poppaea, he surrendered to her. She had, it seems, a gift for understanding him, his vulnerabilities, his insecurities, his desperate need for praise, and she wielded that gift like a weapon. Where others flattered him clumsily, Poppaea knew how to strike the exact balance, encouraging his artistic passions, validating his sense of grandeur, feeding his belief that he was destined for more than rulership. She was the mirror in which Nero saw the emperor he wanted to be. But if Poppaea fed his ego, she also challenged his loyalties. His marriage to Octavia was a political necessity, a bond that tied him to the memory of his adoptive father, Claudius. To cast Octavia aside was to insult powerful factions within Rome, yet Nero was willing to risk it. So strong was his obsession with Poppaea that he began to reshape reality itself around her. First came the small gestures, lavish gifts that drained the imperial treasury, perfumes from Arabia, silks from China, gems brought across dangerous deserts and seas. These were not just tokens of affection but trophies of conquest, proof that the empire itself existed to satisfy her. Then came the guards stationed around her, ostensibly to protect her, but in truth to watch her every movement, every glance, every whispered word. Nero's love was not freedom, it was surveillance. The court watched nervously as his infatuation grew. A Roman emperor was expected to take lovers, but to risk political stability for passion was dangerous. Poppaea, however, was not simply a lover. She was a strategist. She understood that beauty faded, but influence endured. She began to weave her own network of allies in the Senate and the military, ensuring that if Nero faltered, she would not stand alone. The affair that had begun as whispers in candlelit corridors soon became a spectacle no one could ignore. And then came the moment that shocked Rome. Nero divorced Octavia. It was more than a personal decision, it was a declaration that he would bend tradition, politics, even morality to his will. The divorce alienated supporters, sparked protests, and filled the streets with angry murmurs. But Nero did not care. He had chosen Poppaea, and to prove his devotion, He would make her Empress of Rome. The wedding that followed was unlike anything the empire had seen. Draped in gold, attended by the wealthiest and most powerful men in the known world, it was a performance staged not for the gods, but for Nero himself. He wanted all of Rome to see that he had claimed her. Yet beneath the glitter and the celebration, something darker was unfolding. For Nero, this was not marriage, it was possession. He did not love Poppaea as a partner. He loved her as one might love a rare jewel or a flawless statue. She was not his equal, but his prize. And for Poppaea, the game was equally dangerous. She had achieved the highest station possible, but she had tethered herself to a man whose moods shifted like storms. She was powerful, but she was also trapped. She was adored, but she was watched. And though she knew how to maneuver through politics, she was beginning to learn the terrible cost of living with a man who mistook obsession for devotion. The seeds of tragedy had been planted, and soon they would bear fatal fruit. For a time, the marriage between Nero and Poppaea glittered with all the spectacle of imperial Rome. The city had never seen such opulence. The wedding itself was drenched in extravagance. Garlands of imported flowers hung from marble columns, fountains spouted wine instead of water, and musicians filled the air with songs that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. To the Roman elite, it was a performance of power. To Nero, it was something more, a public coronation of his obsession. But once the vows were exchanged, the true nature of their union became clear. Nero did not simply want a wife. He wanted Poppaea to exist entirely within the cage of his devotion. He had conquered provinces, commanded legions, and bent the Senate to his will. Yet his greatest conquest, in his mind, was not Britannia or Armenia. It was the woman he now called his Empress. The signs of possession appeared quickly. He began to isolate her from her family, ensuring that no voice but his could reach her. Friends who had once dined with her suddenly found themselves unwelcome, replaced by attendants whose loyalty was not to Poppaea but to Nero. Every smile, every conversation, every fleeting glance she gave was monitored. Her world shrank until it orbited around him alone. Nero adorned her with gifts that seemed less like tokens of love and more like chains of gold. He stripped the imperial treasury to satisfy her, presenting jewels from India, pearls from the Red Sea, and silks carried along the treacherous roads of the East. Perfumes from Arabia clung to her skin, while her wardrobe contained fabrics that peasants in Rome could scarcely imagine. But these treasures were not just luxuries, they were proof to Nero, and to all of Rome, that she belonged to him. He even began to reshape the empire itself in her image. Statues of Poppaea appeared across the city, their delicate features immortalized in marble. Painters filled canvases with her likeness, while sculptors carved busts that were placed in both private and public spaces. Nero commissioned portraits not merely to honor her beauty, but to replicate her presence. If she could not be physically before him, her image would suffice. Ancient sources describe scenes almost surreal in their intensity. Nero sitting for hours, watching her silently as she moved about the palace. He was not a husband admiring his wife, but a collector admiring his prize, as though afraid that if he looked away, she might vanish. For Poppaea, this devotion was both intoxicating and terrifying. She had ascended higher than any woman in Rome could dream, her influence stretching deep into politics, her voice echoing in the emperor's ear. But she must have understood that her power was fragile. It rested not on her own authority, but on the unstable foundation of Nero's obsession. One shift in his mood, one spark of anger, could turn devotion into destruction. And yet she did not shrink from her role. Poppaea was ambitious, and she wielded her influence with skill. She advanced the interests of her allies, secured positions for her family, and carved out her own network of power in the empire. She had learned to walk the knife's edge, balancing Nero's volatile love with her own ambitions. But there was a flaw in her armor. Unlike the sycophants of the court who bent and bowed to Nero's every whim, Poppaea did not always hide her disapproval. She was not afraid to argue with him, to mock his artistic pursuits when they fell short, to remind him perhaps too often that even an emperor could be ridiculous. Her sharp tongue, so enchanting in moments of intimacy, could also cut deeply. And in Rome, where an emperor's pride was as sacred as his crown, every cut was dangerous. It was only a matter of time before possession would turn violent. The summer of 65 AD began like many others in Nero's Rome, filled with festivals, performances, and the constant murmur of palace intrigue. Yet within the marble halls of the Palatine, tension was mounting. Nero and Poppaea, once united in passion, had grown prone to arguments, sharp, private battles that contrasted with the gilded perfection they displayed in public. Ancient historians record conflicting details about the day it happened, but the outlines are always the same. a quarrel spiraled into violence, and the Empress of Rome, pregnant with what might have been Nero's heir, lay fatally injured. Tacitus tells us the argument began over Nero's priorities. Poppaea, weary from pregnancy, reproached him for neglecting his duties as a husband and father in favor of his endless obsession with theatre and racing. To anyone else, her words might have seemed little more than a wife's exasperation, but to Nero, who lived in constant hunger for adoration and deference, they were an unbearable humiliation. Suetonius, the gossip-loving chronicler of Rome's emperors, claims the quarrel was about something more trivial: Nero returning late from the races. Cassius Dio, writing later, suggests the scene was one of unchecked fury, with Nero striking her violently in a fit of rage. The accounts differ, but they converge on one chilling truth. A blow, whether a single brutal kick or a sustained attack, was delivered to her abdomen. The child she carried died instantly, and Poppaea herself collapsed, her life ebbing away on the polished marble floors of the palace. Imagine that moment. The Emperor of Rome, a man who commanded 30 legions, who could end or spare lives with a word, stood over the body of the woman he had claimed to love above all others. The woman for whom he had cast aside tradition, defied political expectation, and reshaped the empire's gaze. And in a single eruption of violence, he destroyed her. What followed was not the composed dignity of an emperor, but the panic of a man who had broken his own obsession. Ancient sources paint the scene with almost theatrical despair. Nero throwing himself on her body, begging for forgiveness, then shouting at her to live, as though his imperial command could reverse death itself. Physicians were summoned at once, threatened with torture if they failed to revive her, bribed with fortunes if they could save her. But medicine in Rome, crude as it was, could do nothing against mortal wounds. Within hours, Poppaea was gone, her unborn child with her. For Rome, the death of an empress was tragedy enough. For Nero, it was a fracture in his soul. He had not simply lost a wife, he had lost the one person who seemed to complete the illusion of himself as both emperor and artist, ruler and lover. And because it was his own violence that had caused it, the guilt festered like a wound that could never heal. But Nero was not a man who knew how to live with guilt. Instead, he sought to reshape reality around it. If Poppaea had died, then he would pretend she had not. If the world had lost her, then he would conjure her presence by force of will. The emperor who had once seemed golden was now a man untethered from truth itself. The death of Poppaea marked the beginning of Nero's unraveling. His reign would no longer be measured in policies or performances, but in obsessions that twisted into nightmares. And soon, in the hollow left by her absence, he would find a new vessel to carry her ghost, an innocent boy named Sporus. The Roman custom for the death of a noblewoman was simple and solemn: cremation, the body burned on a pyre, ashes interred in a family tomb. It was a ritual of release, an acceptance that the spirit had departed. But Nero would not allow it. When Poppaea Sabina died, he could not let her go. Instead, he ordered her body embalmed, a practice far more Egyptian than Roman, and placed within a tomb whose grandeur surpassed even that of emperors before her. The chamber glistened with gold and marble, adorned with statues that immortalized her beauty, as though he could preserve her not only in stone, but in memory itself. He declared her divine, a goddess worthy of worship, and established a cult in her honor. Across Rome, temples and shrines were compelled to honor the dead empress, her name spoken as though she still reigned. But Nero's grief was not the mourning of a man who had lost his beloved. It was the grief of a man who refused to admit loss at all. Ancient writers describe scenes that straddle the line between tragedy and horror. Nero sitting beside her corpse, whispering to it, addressing her in the present tense. He commanded courtiers to leave her seat empty at banquets, as though she might arrive at any moment. To speak of her in the past tense was dangerous, even fatal. Senators, servants, even family members were forced to participate in the fiction that Poppaea still lived. This was no ordinary mourning. This was denial elevated to imperial decree. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, demanded that reality bend to his grief. And yet, beneath the ritual and the illusion, guilt gnawed at him. Tacitus hints at Nero's desperate attempts to wash away his crime, not just in tears, but in acts of theatre. He funded extravagant games in her honor, offered sacrifices, and commissioned works of art that depicted her as a goddess ascending to the heavens. Perhaps he believed that if Rome worshipped her, her spirit might forgive him. Or perhaps he sought to convince himself that by exalting her memory, he could erase the memory of how she died. But grief, when denied, becomes something monstrous. Nero's longing for Poppaea grew into obsession. An obsession not with who she truly was, but with the idea of her. He needed her presence, her beauty, her image. even if it had to be conjured artificially. And it was in this dangerous state of mind that he noticed a young courtier, slender, delicate-featured, with eyes that mirrored Poppaea's. His name was Sporus. To Nero, it must have seemed like fate itself had delivered him a chance at redemption. Here was a boy who resembled the woman he had destroyed. Here was an opportunity to undo the irreversible, to bring back what death and his own violence had stolen. Of course, to any sane observer, the resemblance was nothing more than coincidence. But Nero was no longer sane. To him, the boy was not Sporus. He was Poppaea reborn. And if nature had not made the resemblance complete, Nero had the power and the cruelty to force it. The story of Sporus begins here, in the shadow of a tomb where a dead empress lay embalmed, and in the mind of an emperor who could not accept that she was gone. Sporus was little more than a boy when fate, or perhaps Nero's obsession, drew him into the heart of imperial Rome's darkest nightmare. His origins are hazy, but most historians believe he was born into slavery within the imperial household. This, paradoxically, was both a curse and a kind of privilege. In Rome, to be a slave of the emperor was to live closer to power than most freeborn citizens ever would. Palatial walls meant access to fine tutors, training in letters and administration, and a life far removed from the back-breaking labor of fields or mines. Sporus was eventually freed, becoming a libertus, a freedman of the imperial court. Yet freedom was relative. A freedman's life was tethered entirely to the favor of the emperor. One moment, he might be trusted with delicate state business. The next, he could be discarded or executed with no appeal. Sporus grew up in this gilded cage, groomed for service, educated, polished, and watched. He might have expected a life in quiet bureaucracy, managing accounts or assisting in the daily machinery of the palace. But destiny, in the form of Nero's grief, had other plans. What set Sporus apart was not his skill, but his face. Ancient sources, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, and others note the same haunting detail. He bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea Sabina, the empress who had died at Nero's own hands. His delicate bone structure, the softness of his eyes, the shape of his features, whether by chance or imagination, seemed to echo the woman Nero could not release. In a culture that believed physical resemblance could signal spiritual connection, this likeness carried a weight far beyond appearance. To Nero, it was as though Poppaea herself had returned in another form. When he looked at Sporus, he did not see a young man with a future of his own. He saw a vessel for the ghost he could not banish. It is chilling to imagine their first encounter. Perhaps it was in a corridor of the palace, or at a banquet where the emperor's eye drifted over the crowd and suddenly froze. Perhaps Sporus, used to invisibility, felt the air change as the emperor's gaze lingered too long. A boy accustomed to serving wine or carrying scrolls now found himself caught in the trap of Nero's fixation, and from that moment, his life ceased to belong to him. Nero had the power to reshape reality itself, or at least to demand that everyone else accept the reality he imagined. And so he decided that Sporus would no longer be a boy, no longer himself. He would become Poppaea, restored to flesh. The resemblance was not enough. Nero would make it complete, and in doing so, he would commit one of the most cruelly calculated acts of dehumanization in Roman history. Sporus had no say in the matter. He could not protest, could not flee. To defy Nero was to die, and death in Rome was rarely swift or merciful. So he endured, as the emperor summoned physicians and began preparations for what he called transformation, but what history remembers as mutilation. The boy who had grown up inside the palace walls, educated for service, was about to be stripped of everything: his body, his identity, his name. From this point forward, Sporus would no longer exist in his own right. He would become a shadow of the dead empress, a living reflection of Nero's grief, and the first step would be surgery. The decision was swift, but the act itself was slow, brutal, and irreversible. Nero, consumed by the fantasy that Sporus was Poppaea reborn, ordered his physicians to carry out a procedure that even in Rome was shocking. The boy would be castrated. It is difficult to overstate the cruelty of this command. Surgery in the ancient world was primitive at best. Rome had skilled physicians, yes, but their tools were crude: bronze scalpels, cauterizing irons, herbal poultices for pain. Anesthesia did not exist beyond wine, opium, or mandrake root, and these dulled the senses only slightly. The patient remained awake, writhing, screaming, pinned down by attendants. Infection was common, blood loss almost inevitable. For many, such a procedure was a death sentence, but Nero was emperor. He could command life, death, and everything in between. And so, Sporus was forced onto a table within the palace itself. Guards held him down as the physicians began. The marble floors of Rome's greatest halls, designed for imperial feasts and triumphs, echoed now with the cries of a boy being remade against his will. If he survived, and somehow he did, it was not triumph, but tragedy. His body was forever altered. He would never father children, never know the life of an ordinary Roman man. More than his flesh, his identity was torn away. Rome was a society built on rigid notions of masculinity, where strength and virility defined a man's worth. To strip that away was not only physical violence, it was social erasure. Castration in Rome was rare and carried deep stigma. Eunuchs were more common in Eastern empires like Persia or later Byzantium, where they sometimes held positions of influence. In Rome, however, the practice was despised, associated with shame, weakness, and the unnatural. To make a Roman youth into a eunuch was to exile him from his very identity, and yet Nero demanded not only that Sporus be castrated, but that the transformation go further. The boy was to become, in body and behavior, Poppaea Sabina herself. To understand the depth of this cruelty, imagine waking each day to find your own reflection slipping away, your gestures corrected, your voice reshaped, your clothing designed not for who you are, but for who someone else wishes you to be. This was the life Nero imposed on Sporus. The emperor saw himself as a godlike creator, capable of sculpting reality as he pleased. But Sporus was not marble, not canvas, not clay. He was a living human being. And yet to Nero, he was raw material, something to be molded until Poppaea walked again through the halls of the palace. The court must have watched in horror, though none dared speak. Senators and courtiers who would normally have ridiculed such acts instead bowed their heads, pretending this was normal. For to acknowledge the truth that the emperor had mutilated a boy to replace his dead wife was to risk their own lives, and so the illusion grew. Sporus, barely past childhood, endured weeks of recovery as his body healed. But there was no return to himself. When he rose from his bed, he rose not as Sporus, but as the ghost of another. The boy had been broken. The Empress was about to be created. Once the surgery was done, Nero's obsession entered its next phase. The emperor did not simply want Sporus altered, he wanted him remade. If the resemblance to Poppaea was only partial, then the rest could be forced into place through artifice, discipline, and endless performance. The palace became a stage, and Sporus its unwilling actor. Imperial seamstresses worked tirelessly, creating gowns cut from silks that shimmered like water under torchlight. Each garment was tailored to soften the lines of his altered body, disguising what remained of masculinity and emphasizing delicate elegance. Jewelers set to work crafting ornaments once worn by Poppaea herself, ensuring that even the sparkle of gemstones bound Sporus to her memory. Every bracelet clasped around his wrist, every pearl hung from his ears, was a chain forged in grief and obsession. But clothing was only the beginning. Tutors were assigned to mold him into the perfect echo of the dead empress. He learned how to walk with deliberate grace, how to move his hands softly when gesturing, how to lower his eyes in a manner considered feminine in Roman society. Servants spent hours each day arranging his hair into elaborate curls, braids, and sculpted styles favored by noblewomen. Makeup artists applied powders to soften the angles of his face, rouges to tint his cheeks, and charcoal to widen the eyes. Each brushstroke erased Sporus further, until even his reflection belonged to someone else. Voice coaches worked with him relentlessly, demanding he raise his pitch, alter his cadence, speak with the lilting tones of Roman aristocratic women. This was perhaps the most punishing lesson, for language was identity. Every word Sporus spoke became a reminder that his true voice had been silenced. Imagine the psychological torment. Each morning, he woke in chambers decorated with Poppaea's likeness, her statues watching from the corners, her jewelry waiting on polished tables. Each night, he was dismissed only after hours of rehearsals in femininity, as though he were a living marionette. Day after day, the young man was forced to watch himself vanish into the role of another, a woman he had never met, yet one he was commanded to embody completely. For Nero, this transformation was a victory over death itself. He boasted that he had brought Poppaea back, reshaped in youthful flesh. He paraded Sporus before his courtiers, daring anyone to question the illusion, and none did. Even the most jaded senators, men who had seen emperors commit every imaginable excess, lowered their eyes and played along. To laugh, to whisper, to suggest that the emperor's empress was anything but real, such an act was treason. Yet for Sporus, the performance was survival. He quickly learned that the smallest misstep, an unladylike stride, a voice too deep, a gesture out of place could provoke Nero's wrath. So he adapted, as best he could, perfecting the mask. Historians note that he became skilled in the role, able to anticipate Nero's moods and mirror the memories Nero projected onto him. But behind the mask lay silence, grief, and a hollowing loneliness no courtier could see. Rome itself seemed caught in the emperor's dream. The city buzzed with gossip, but none dared speak it too loudly. The people had grown used to strange excesses, emperors who built golden palaces, who declared themselves gods, who made war on the sea itself. But even in such a world, the sight of Sporus, dressed in jewels and silks, walking beside Nero as his empress, must have struck them with a mixture of awe and horror. The boy had become a phantom, a doll, an echo of a woman who no longer lived. And still, the transformation was not complete, for Nero demanded a final act of theatre. If Sporus was truly Poppaea reborn, then he must be married to her widower. The emperor would wed his creation. Spring of 67 AD. Rome prepared for a spectacle unlike any it had ever seen. Weddings among the elite were usually private affairs, lavish, yes, but reserved for family and allies. This was different. Nero, who considered his life the grandest performance in history, intended the marriage of Sporus to be a public declaration, staged as if Jupiter himself were officiating. The palace halls were transformed into a theatre of magnificence. Imported flowers carpeted the marble floors, their fragrance so heavy it clung to the air. Thousands of oil lamps illuminated gilded walls, their flames dancing in bronze mirrors until the whole chamber seemed to glow. Musicians tuned lyres and flutes, while priests rehearsed the sacred rites normally reserved for a union between man and woman. And at the center of it all stood Sporus, draped in garments cut from shimmering silks, adorned with jewels that had once belonged to Poppaea. A veil covered his face, not only to imitate a Roman bride, but also to blur whatever traces of boyhood remained. He was the picture of an empress, but an empress sculpted through pain, fear, and relentless coercion. The aristocrats of Rome gathered, their expressions carefully composed. They knew better than to betray their true feelings. To laugh or protest was unthinkable. They would smile, they would bow, and they would offer their congratulations as though nothing about this ceremony defied nature, law, or reason. And yet, behind their eyes, there must have been horror. Even the jaded elite of Rome, accustomed to decadence and cruelty, had never seen such a performance. The ceremony proceeded with full ritual. Nero and Sporus clasped hands before the altar, the traditional gesture of Roman marriage. They exchanged vows, sharing sacred bread as priests intoned blessings to the gods. Contracts were signed, dowries declared, and at last the emperor lifted the veil from Sporus's face, presenting him to the court not as a youth, not as a eunuch, but as Sabina, the name of the dead empress reborn. It was theatre of the grotesque, and yet it was binding. In the eyes of the law, the rites had been fulfilled. In the eyes of Nero, the impossible had been accomplished. He had resurrected Poppaea. Afterward came the feasting. Servants carried silver platters heavy with roasted meats, exotic fruits, and pastries dripping with honey. Wine flowed endlessly, dulled perhaps to help courtiers forget the unease twisting in their stomachs. Musicians played, dancers spun, and all the while Nero sat at the head of the banquet, radiating pride. Sporus, seated beside him, smiled with practiced composure, the mask of a wife fastened tightly to his face. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was suffocating. Everyone in that hall knew they were participants in a lie. They were watching the emperor marry, not a woman, not even a man in disguise, but a boy mutilated and remade into a ghost. And to question it even silently was to risk exile, imprisonment, or death. For Nero, however, this was triumph. He had bent reality to his will, forced the empire to applaud a ceremony that should never have been. In his mind, he had defeated grief, conquered death, and proven his power greater than nature itself. For Sporus, the wedding was the final act of erasure. His body had been altered, his name replaced, his reflection transformed. And now, in the eyes of Rome, he was no longer Sporus at all. He was Poppaea Sabina, Empress of Rome, wife of the emperor. The doll had been dressed, the illusion perfected, the performance made eternal. But survival in such a role would mean surrendering every shred of his true self. From this night forward, the boy was gone. Only the empress remained. After the wedding, Sporus's existence became one of gilded captivity. Nero treated him, in every outward sense, as though he were truly the Empress of Rome. Sporus was given his own household staff, chambers decorated in marble and silk, and even a retinue of attendants whose only duty was to serve him. He traveled in a litter carried by slaves, surrounded by guards and fanfare, his presence announced as though he were a legitimate imperial consort. But all of it, the luxury, the honors, the wealth was poisoned. These were not rewards, but the trappings of a role he could not escape. Sporus was not a man living his life. He was a character forced to perform a part written by Nero's grief. Every glance, every smile, every word had to fit the script of Poppaea Sabina. At state banquets, Nero seated him by his side, the place of honor reserved for an empress. Guests were expected to converse with him as though he were the real Poppaea, recalling stories and memories that he himself had never lived. If Nero reminisced about a moment from his past marriage, Sporus had to respond as if he remembered it, too, playing the role so convincingly that the illusion remained intact. A single slip, a hesitation, could mean disaster. In private, the weight of the performance grew heavier still. Nero addressed him only as Sabina, speaking tenderly or angrily depending on his mood, but always with the conviction that he was speaking to his dead wife. He demanded affection, devotion, and obedience. Sporus's survival depended on anticipating these demands, shaping his responses to satisfy an emperor whose temper could turn murderous without warning. To endure this life was to live in constant tension, a high-stakes theater where the cost of failure was death. Sporus became adept at reading Nero's moods, his expressions, even the rhythm of his footsteps in the halls, so that he might act accordingly before a word was spoken. The boy had been turned into a doll, but a doll who had learned that his very breath depended on flawless performance. And yet, despite the horror, the court played along. Senators, generals, and aristocrats, all of them watched the emperor's living illusion with carefully controlled expressions. Some must have recoiled inwardly, but none dared betray it. To them, Sporus was not a victim to be pitied, but a dangerous reminder of their own vulnerability. If Nero could erase a boy's identity and make him empress, what could he not do to them? The cruelty lay not only in Nero's demands, but in the silence of those around him. Sporus was paraded through the empire as though the fiction were truth, and the weight of that lie pressed down on him from every direction. In Rome, in the palace, on the streets, no one would acknowledge who he really was. He had ceased to exist in the eyes of the world, and yet, even within this prison of performance, something remained. Historians note that Sporus grew increasingly quiet, melancholic, reserved. Perhaps it was despair, or perhaps it was a kind of inner resistance, the last spark of self buried beneath the costume of an empress. But the show was not confined to Rome. For Nero, the world itself was a stage, and his living doll would soon have to play the role of empress before foreign audiences. The next act of the tragedy would unfold not in the familiar marble halls of the Palatine, but across the seas, in the ancient land of Greece. In 66 AD, Nero's restlessness could no longer be contained within the marble walls of Rome. He had grown weary of the Senate's whispers, the nobles' veiled contempt, and the endless weight of rulership. What he longed for was not governance, but applause. And so he declared he would travel to Greece, the cradle of theatre, music, and games, to showcase his talents as an artist. For centuries, Rome had conquered Greece militarily, but in matters of culture, Greece remained supreme. Its cities, Athens, Corinth, Olympia, Delphi, still pulsed with the legacy of philosophy, poetry, and performance. To win admiration, there would mean more to Nero than any military triumph. He dreamed not of parades of soldiers, but of crowns of laurel placed upon his brow by Greek judges, of roaring crowds, acclaiming him as the greatest performer in history. Naturally, he brought Sporus. Imagine the sight, the emperor of Rome arriving in Greece with his court, bearing the boy, empress by his side. To the Greeks, accustomed to eccentric rulers but still bound by their traditions, this must have seemed like a grotesque masquerade. A teenage eunuch, dressed in silks and jewels, veiled like a Roman bride, presented as the empress of the world's greatest empire. And yet none dared laugh aloud. Nero was their conqueror, and their survival depended on honoring his delusion. The tour became a blur of spectacles. Nero competed in athletic games, though he cared little for rules. At Olympia, he entered the chariot race with a team of 10 horses, instead of the traditional 4. He fell from the chariot midway through, but was nevertheless crowned the victor. At musical contests, judges declared him winner before he even began, their voices trembling with fear that a wrong verdict might cost their lives. The Greek cities, desperate to please him, renamed festivals in his honor and erected statues celebrating his artistic genius. And through it all, Sporus was displayed as the empress. He walked beside Nero during ceremonies, sat in honor at feasts, and was introduced to dignitaries as though he were Poppaea herself, restored from death. The illusion extended even across the sea, where foreign audiences who had never known Poppaea were still forced to participate in the fiction. But beneath the applause and garlands, there was unease. Greek aristocrats, proud of their heritage, must have whispered in private, mocking the emperor's absurdities. Yet no one spoke openly. Fear was stronger than ridicule. They bowed, they smiled, they pretended to believe. For Sporus, the journey was another prison, only larger. Every festival, every banquet, every foreign stage became a new theatre in which he was compelled to play the part of Poppaea. His image was paraded before strangers who judged him not as himself, but as the ghost of another. He could not escape, for even beyond Rome, Nero's will was law. And yet the cracks in Nero's reign were beginning to show. While he basked in Greek adulation, unrest simmered back home. Governors chafed at his neglect, soldiers murmured at his extravagance, and whispers of rebellion spread. Nero believed he was winning crowns of laurel, but in Rome, he was losing the empire. The Greek tour was meant to be a triumph. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end. When Nero finally returned to Italy in 68 AD, garlanded with prizes he had awarded himself, he returned to an empire ready to collapse beneath him. And Sporus, still trapped at his side, would soon learn that the downfall of an emperor did not mean freedom for his living doll. It meant a new stage, a new master, and even greater peril. When Nero returned from Greece in 68 AD, he was radiant with self-delusion. He paraded through Rome as though he were a conquering hero, displaying hundreds of crowns and trophies he had been awarded abroad, most of them given out of fear rather than admiration. He declared himself the greatest artist the world had ever seen, boasting that his performances would echo through eternity. But while Nero celebrated, Rome had grown restless. His tours had drained the treasury, his neglect of governance left the empire fraying at its edges, and his endless demands for flattery had exhausted even his loyalists. Governors in Gaul and Spain began to murmur rebellion. In the provinces, legions were more loyal to their commanders than to the distant, self-absorbed emperor. The Senate seethed quietly, waiting for a chance to strike. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, were wavering, tempted by bribes from rivals. The empire that had once bowed to Nero's every whim was slipping away. It began with whispers, then open defiance. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, raised the standard of revolt. Soon Servius Sulpicius Galba in Spain followed, declaring himself ready to take power. These were not minor conspiracies. They were cracks in the foundation of an empire that could not hold under the weight of one man's madness. In Rome, panic spread. Senators debated in secret. Courtiers began to distance themselves from Nero, subtly shifting their loyalties to Galba. And the Praetorian Guard, tempted by promises of gold, finally betrayed their emperor. The men who had once sworn to die for him abandoned him instead. The Senate acted swiftly. They condemned Nero as a public enemy, stripping him of his titles and declaring his reign over. For a man who had once been worshipped as a god, the humiliation was complete. Nero was no longer an emperor. He was a fugitive. In the chaos, Nero fled the city with a handful of companions, among them Sporus. Even at the edge of ruin, Nero clung to the boy he had remade. Perhaps Sporus represented, in Nero's fractured mind, the last vestige of his control, the final piece of the illusion that his power remained absolute. Or perhaps he could not bear to part with the living reflection of the woman he had lost. Whatever the reason, Sporus remained at his side, bound to him until the bitter end. They hid in a villa outside Rome, waiting for news. Nero, once the master of legions, now trembled like a trapped animal. He spoke of fleeing to the east, of begging Galba for mercy, of throwing himself at the feet of the people to win their forgiveness. At times he raved like an actor, rehearsing his final role, imagining how posterity would remember him. At other times he sat in despair, convinced that Rome would spit on his memory. But as the hoofbeats of soldiers drew nearer, the fantasy collapsed. His companions urged him to take his own life before capture, knowing that the Senate would otherwise humiliate him in chains, parading him through the streets before executing him. For a Roman noble, and especially an emperor, such dishonor was worse than death. Nero hesitated, weeping, praying, clutching at his throat as though rehearsing the blow but unable to strike it. At last, with soldiers closing in, he begged a loyal freedman to drive a dagger into his neck, guiding the blade himself. His final words, according to legend, were theatrical: "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. Rome was thrown into chaos, the year of the 4 emperors dawning in blood and uncertainty. For Sporus, Nero's death was not liberation. It was a terrifying new chapter. The boy who had been turned into a ghost empress now stood alone, marked by his association with the most hated emperor in Roman history. And in the scramble for power that followed, He would not be treated as a survivor, he would be treated as spoils. The villa where Nero spent his final hours was quiet, almost eerily so, compared to the roar of the Roman Forum he once commanded. As news spread that the Senate had branded him a public enemy, the emperor who had once bent the world to his will was reduced to trembling fear. With him were only a few attendants, loyal out of habit or desperation, and among them still, always was Sporus. The irony was cruel. Nero had turned the boy into a symbol of his power, a living monument to his own ability to remake reality. Yet now, as imperial authority crumbled, Sporus was forced to witness its end at the most intimate scale. The man who once demanded worship as a god now wept like a child, begging others to show him the courage he could not find within himself. Ancient accounts paint the moment with almost theatrical precision. Nero, hearing the sound of horses approaching, panicked. Capture meant degradation. He imagined himself dragged through the streets of Rome, stripped naked, mocked by jeering crowds, executed with all the cruelty the Senate could devise. For a man who had lived his life as performance, the idea of such a final act was intolerable. Still, he faltered. He could not bring himself to plunge the dagger. His attendants urged him on, reminding him of honor, of dignity, of the fate that awaited if he delayed. Finally, he pressed the blade to his throat. Whether guided by his own hand or pushed by a freedman named Epaphroditos, the cut was made. His last words, half boast, half lament, were recorded by Suetonius, "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me. And with that, the curtain fell. For Rome, his death marked both relief and uncertainty. The Senate declared victory, and Galba prepared to march into the city as the new emperor. The streets erupted with rumor and uneasy celebration, the people not yet knowing that civil war was only beginning. But for Sporus, the death of Nero was no deliverance. He had been crafted into the image of Poppaea, paraded as an empress, and bound inseparably to the man now despised as a tyrant. His very existence was a reminder of Nero's madness. To Galba, and those who followed, Sporus was both a liability and a prize, an ornament of humiliation, a living relic of a fallen reign. In the shifting tides of power, he was not a person, but property. Nero had used him as an object to soothe grief. Now others would use him as a token of victory. The boy who had been forced into a woman's role would discover that Nero's death did not end his torment. Instead, it ensured that his body, his name, and his stolen identity would continue to be passed between the hands of emperors, each more ruthless than the last. The nightmare was far from over. With Nero gone, Rome spiraled into chaos. The year 69 AD would be remembered as the year of the four emperors, a brutal carousel of ambition where generals and governors fought to seize the purple, and the empire itself seemed to teeter on collapse. In that maelstrom of shifting power, Sporus, barely 20 years old, became an unwilling pawn in games far larger than himself. The first to claim him was Otho. Once a friend and companion of Nero, Otho had known both the extravagance of the late emperor's court and the shadowy secrets that lingered there. Taking Sporus into his household was not simply indulgence, it was political theatre. By keeping Nero's empress at his side, Otho could subtly align himself with the memory of the fallen ruler, appealing to those who still held loyalty to the old dynasty. For Sporus, the nightmare continued. The silks, the jewels, the performance of femininity all remained, now under a new master's eye. But Otho's reign was fleeting. After only 3 months, he was defeated in battle by Vitellius and took his own life. And so Sporus was passed once more, like treasure looted from a palace. Vitellius treated him not with affection, nor even obsession, but as a curiosity. To Vitellius, Sporus was living proof of Nero's decadence, a plaything to display before others, a symbol of the grotesque excesses of the past. He kept the boy dressed as Poppaea, paraded at feasts, called by the dead empress's name. But there was no tenderness in it, no delusion of love, only cruelty. To Vitellius, Sporus was an instrument of mockery, his identity stripped for the amusement of Rome's new ruler. Ancient writers hint that Sporus was not only paraded, but humiliated, his presence used to remind others of Nero's fall and Vitellius's supremacy. Each banquet, each gathering became another stage on which Sporus had to perform the role that had been carved into him, yet now with the added sting of knowing he was not cherished, but ridiculed. It is hard to imagine the depth of despair that must have weighed on him. To survive, Nero had meant surrendering to a fantasy. To survive Vitellius meant enduring degradation in the open. He was not even an illusion of love anymore. He was a living relic, stripped of dignity, his very existence a grotesque reminder of Rome's capacity for cruelty. And yet his story darkened further still. For Vitellius, glutted with victory and eager for entertainment, conceived a final humiliation, one that would turn Sporus's life into spectacle for the masses. The emperor planned to cast him into the arena, not to fight as a gladiator, but to reenact a scene from mythology, a staged violation before thousands of jeering spectators. Sporus, forced to embody a woman's role in front of Rome itself, would become not only a doll, but a public joke. It was to be the final act of erasure. But Sporus, who had endured mutilation, false marriage, and years of humiliation, would not allow the empire to write the script for his ending. The plan of Vitellius was as grotesque as it was calculated. He intended to thrust Sporus into the Colosseum, not as a gladiator armed for battle, but as a character in a cruel play. The role was to be that of Persephone, the maiden of myth dragged into the underworld by Hades. Before tens of thousands of spectators, Sporus was to be publicly violated, his suffering staged as entertainment for Rome's insatiable appetite for blood and spectacle. For Sporus, it was the final and unbearable indignity. He had already been stripped of his body, his name, his freedom, and his identity. He had been paraded as a ghost wife, mocked as a living symbol of a fallen emperor, and displayed as a curiosity at banquets. But to be thrown into the arena, reduced to the plaything of a crowd, was more than even he could endure. And so he made a choice, the only choice left to him. Rather than submit to the degradation Vitellius had prepared, Sporus ended his life by his own hand. The details are uncertain. Some say he poisoned himself, others that he slit his veins. But the meaning was clear. In death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been denied him in life, his agency. He was no more than 20 years old. To the historians of antiquity, Sporus became a footnote, a symbol of Nero's madness, a curiosity in the catalogue of imperial excess. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, they recorded him not as a person, but as a reflection of the cruelty of emperors. They did not ask what he had dreamed of as a boy, what ambitions or joys he might have held before fate consigned him to Nero's gaze. His voice was never preserved, his thoughts never written. He was remembered only as what others forced him to be. And yet, across 2,000 years, his story still lingers. Not because he was powerful, but because he was powerless. Because his life exposes the darkest corners of absolute power, the ability not just to kill, but to erase, to unmake, to turn a human being into a doll, a symbol, a plaything. When Sporus chose death, it was both tragedy and defiance, a refusal to be further humiliated, even at the cost of his life. In that moment, he reclaimed the one decision no emperor could take from him: how his story would end. Perhaps that is why his name survives. Faint but persistent, echoing through history. Not as a curiosity, but as a warning, that behind every tale of imperial grandeur, there are human lives broken beneath it, that cruelty thrives when silence endures, and that even in the grip of empire, a spark of self can survive long enough to choose defiance. Sporus was the boy who became an empress, the youth who lived as a ghost, the captive who made his final act his own. His story reminds us that power, when unchecked, can twist grief into obsession and human beings into shadows. But it also reminds us that even the smallest act of defiance, a life ended on one's own terms, can echo louder than the cruelty that sought to erase it.